You wake up on Monday dreading the commute, rushing to optimize manufactured corporate metrics that nobody's life depends upon. By Friday, you start to feel like yourself again, only for the cycle to reset. This numbness is a structural feature of a system designed specifically to extract your energy and return as little as possible. And that exact diagnosis was written over a century and a half ago by a man who couldn't even afford a winter coat. Karl Marx spent the 1850s walking to the British Museum reading room. He sat among parliamentary records and trade statistics, assembling a massive evidentiary critique of early capitalism. While politicians promised that free markets would improve everyone's condition, Marx looked at textile mills where children worked 14-hour shifts and life expectancy in working-class districts dropped below 30. He developed a concept called alienation. When a worker doesn't choose what to make, doesn't own the product, and doesn't control their hours, they are selling their labor as a commodity. In the process, the worker becomes a commodity, emptying out their human creativity. As an analyst, Marx precisely identified the mechanics of this exploitation, yet the collective ownership he prescribed to cure it never materialized in the way he envisioned. To understand why, we have to look at how Marx viewed human progress. He argued that history moves through changes in how we produce what we need to survive, specifically who owns the tools and who does the work. He divided society into two parts. This diagram illustrates the first part, the economic base. This is the physical reality of production, the raw materials, the factories, and the human labor required to make things run. Within this base, owners extract what Marx called surplus value. A worker produces a certain amount of value, but is paid a wage worth much less than that output. The mathematical difference between the two is simply the owner's profit. Resting on top of this economic reality is the superstructure. This layer contains a society's laws, its religions, and its moral philosophies. According to Marx, these are not independent truths, but concepts generated automatically to serve whichever class controls the base. When a worker who owns nothing signs a contract with an employer who owns everything, the superstructure provides the language of free exchange and meritocracy. It disguises raw extraction as a perfectly mutual agreement. Because the superstructure defines the very concepts of merit and fairness, it limits what we imagine as possible. Marx concluded that trying to reform capitalism from within is like trying to rewrite the rules using the owner's pen. It requires total revolution. Marx laid out a strict, mechanical timeline for how this would happen. He predicted that wages would drop relentlessly, the middle class would vanish into the proletariat, and the most heavily industrialized nations would be the first to revolt. But as the 20th century unfolded, the historical evidence directly contradicted his mathematical models. Instead of disappearing, a substantial, wealthy middle class rapidly expanded across the developed world. Real wages rose. Trade unions operating within the capitalist framework successfully secured shorter hours, safer working conditions, and strong legal protections. And when a massive socialist revolution finally did arrive in 1917, it bypassed the industrial centers of England and Germany, erupting instead in the largely agrarian empire of Russia. The rigid timeline fractured upon contact with actual events. This left Marx's intellectual successors scrambling to explain why the inevitable collapse of capitalism had been delayed. A century later, philosopher Karl Popper observed a distinct pattern in how Marxist thinkers responded to these failed predictions. Instead of revising the core theory to account for rising wages and labor reforms, they reinterpreted the data. The revolution wasn't disproven, just delayed. The worker protections were merely temporary concessions by a frightened ruling class. For a theory to be genuinely scientific, it must specify in advance what exact evidence would prove it wrong. Because no possible historical outcome could count against it, Popper argued that Marxism had ceased describing the world. It had become a story elastic enough to absorb any fact. Defenders counter that the theory didn't fail at all. They argue that Marx's writings directly inspired the very labor movements that won those concessions, altering the trajectory of capitalism and temporarily saving the system from itself. Seeing the machine's gears might explain your burnout, but whether that diagnosis offers a way out remains unproven.